The following is a Shaw TV Public Affairs presentation. Constituency Report is produced as a public service by members of the BC Legislature through the facilities of Shaw TV.
Hi there, my name is Hugo Wong, and welcome to Constituency Report. Joining me today is MLA Adam Olsen of Saanich North and the Islands. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
We've got a number of topics here today, and we're going to start, I guess, with just, how are the first few months going?
Well, first of all, thank you for taking me up on the offer. As a reporter for the Peninsula News Review, it was important that we had this opportunity to have this conversation. I think the first couple of months have been, a crash course in provincial politics, let's put it that way. The very unusual summer in BC politics that I'm sure that most people around the constituency have heard about or know about. The summer was very, very busy in the constituency office meeting. We had well over 100 meetings, over 120 meetings or something this summer, meeting with constituents and various organizations. And then we've been, since September the 9th, we've been sitting in the legislature with the new government's first legislative agenda unfolding in front of us. So it's been a very busy first 100 or so days.
Mm-hmm. Now, you started in local politics, right, as a Central Saanich councillor. What's been the change moving from local to provincial?
You know what, I think, first of all, it's a much bigger constituency. I would say that many of the same challenges that we face in Central Saanich, we see, in the other communities across the riding. We've got rural and urban type communities. We've also got the island communities in the Gulf Islands. There's, varying challenges and opportunities that present themselves in our riding. Of course, the number of constituents go from about 20,000 to 50,000. It's a much larger geographic area. So I would say that while some of the issues or the challenges and opportunities are similar, it's a much bigger job in the sense that we're dealing with provincial and as well a much bigger constituency.
Mm-hmm. Now, we are in minority government for the first time in a very long time, and this is the first time. This is probably the biggest responsibility that the Greens have had in government, governing in a very long time. How is that different from the last 16 years?
Well, you know what, I think being a part of the first Green caucus, elected caucus anywhere in North America is a pretty incredible thing. Myself and Sonia Firstnow and Andrew Weaver got elected in May, and there was a lot of attention put on us as we, as you said, held the balance of responsibility, or as some folks like to call it, the balance of power. And so this summer there's been a magnifying glass on Greens, on Green politics. I think that what we're seeing in this legislature play out, and I'm quite excited to see it play out, is much more collaboration between the parties. The confidence and supply agreement that we signed with the government, with the BC NDPs who are now the government, highlights a different kind of way of doing business in British Columbia, where the policy work is right in front of people's eyes to see. They can see what work is going to be accomplished. The priority of the government is highlighted, and so I think that what we're seeing is a much more collaborative work going on here in the legislature, and real strong relationships between government and opposition parties. So, I think that minority situation creates a very nice tension for the people of BC. The tension between the government and the opposition, between the government and us Greens. That tension will serve the people of British Columbia very well.
Mm-hmm. Now, it's important to note that it is a minority government and it's not a coalition. Can you talk a little bit about what the decision behind that was?
Yeah, it was very important for myself and my colleagues to ensure that we remained outside of government. While we are a major part of creating the stability for government, it was important for us to maintain our identity, within this legislature. Coalition governments, the smaller parties usually get subsumed into the governing party. They take roles in cabinet, and it's very difficult to see. The lines are blurred. It's very difficult to see. It was important for us to remain in opposition. And so when we looked at all the varying ways that we could create that stability in government, we found the confidence and supply agreements that are used in other parts of the world. They were used in Ontario, and as well are used quite often in New Zealand. It was important for us to, it was an important opportunity for us to embrace that kind of approach where we help create stability in government, but we also are in opposition. We have the opportunity to hold government to account, to ask them questions in question period, and to remain a clear, distinct identity within the legislature.
So walk me through a little bit about the bullet points that are within the confidence and supply agreement that you've had with the NDP.
Well, I think it's really important first that what's codified in the confidence and supply agreement before we get to any of the policy initiatives is a commitment to change the relationship with Indigenous people in our province. I think for too long we've left the decision making or to the Supreme Court of Canada, these constitutional challenges which have taken decades in many instances to get sorted out. The new government and ourselves, and in the mandate letters of the ministers, it's codified that we are going to be looking at implementing the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's calls to action, and court cases such as Chilcotin. So that is in advance of a very, I think, a very comprehensive package of initiatives to increase confidence in government, for increase the British Columbians' confidence in governance. One of the things that we committed to doing during the campaign and that we followed through with here is getting big money out of politics, something that I'm quite proud of and worked on with the government throughout the summer. As well, the people we're working through a bill right now for a referendum on electoral reform to ensure that our goal is to ensure that everybody's vote counts and is reflected in the legislature once the election is over. As well, another piece that I've been working on is lobbying reform to ensure that lobbyists, when they are registering with the government, it's not just that they're registering, but that we know who they're lobbying, how long they're lobbying them for, what issues they're lobbying them on, and actually who they're lobbying. Currently, right now, that's not happening. Another piece which I would like to highlight is the Emerging Economy Task Force and the Innovation Commissioner. One of the things that we've seen is that government has not been preparing for the changing workforce, the changing the 21st century economy. We've not been preparing for disruptive technological changes in our 21st century economy, and so the Emerging Economy Task Force as well as the Innovation Commission are two components that the BC Greens brought to the Confidence and Supply Agreement that gets government starting to look on the horizon and think about the future of what the economy is going to look like in British Columbia.
So let's take that a little further. So, economies and particularly technology, it's something that's a burgeoning area in BC. It moves so quickly, and government doesn't really have that track record. What is government's role in, say, advancing the tech sector or whatever industries that you believe are going to be up and coming in the province?
I think innovation and creativity is best left to the entrepreneur, that entrepreneurial spirit, the risk taker. And we see that in our riding in Saanich North and the Islands. We've got a lot of entrepreneurs and risk takers, whether it be on the Gulf Islands or in the Sydney North Saanich Business Park or the Central Saanich Business Park in Keating. We have those people, and that is where creativity and innovation comes from. Government's role is to create a regulatory and an enforcement environment that allows for access into the market for these innovative and creative technologies, the disruptive technologies. What we're looking at is actually a change in the business model. So you take a look at ride sharing as an example. We have an incumbent industry, the taxi industry, which has invested significant amounts of capital in the status quo, and we've got tech companies, not just multinational corporations, but local companies that want to enter into this, and the government has not created a playing field in which they can enter into the market, and that the taxi industry's investments are secure, but as well that innovation and creativity in our province is allowed to thrive. And so I think that what we need to do from a governance perspective is create, the big stone blocks that make the legislature are very much an example of the slow pace that the government moves at. And while we need to be measured in our approach, we also need to be open to new technology and new innovations. And I think that that's one of the things that we'd like to do with the government, is to ensure that we're allowing that innovation and creativity to flourish in our province.
You also touched on reconciliation. The term has been used a lot more, I think, in the last couple of years. But in terms of actually implementing it, it can be very challenging with areas like overlapping jurisdiction and property rights. What are some concrete steps that you think that you can take, say in the next, year or two to sort of push that forward?
Yeah, I think, and what we've seen, the dialogue in the place through the fall session has been a lot of, there are many obstacles, there are many challenges, there are many stumbling blocks, and you highlighted one that has been used a lot, which is the overlapping territories. Clearly, it is a challenge for government. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action highlight dozens of ways in which the government can reform its activities in order to embrace reconciliation. The UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People highlight in a number of ways in which we can identify a different approach to relating with the Indigenous peoples of our province. And so what we've seen is that court cases, Supreme Court case after Supreme Court case, has said to the government, you need to sort this out, don't leave it to the courts. And so it is now incumbent upon the current Minister of Indigenous Relations, it's incumbent upon us in opposition to find a way to open up the dialogue, to open up the conversation. One of the tools that I would suggest needs to be used much more than it has in the past, and that's the Standing Committee on Aboriginal Affairs is what it's called. I'm proud to be appointed to that committee. I look forward to it meeting. It hasn't met in 16 years. We have not used one of the primary tools that we could in order to bring Indigenous leaders, scholars, academics, First Nations and Métis and Inuit people into the legislature, get them to testify to us, to provide that very important information to us about how government could embrace the diversity of cultures in this province in a much more appropriate way. And so that would be just one tool that we can use in order to inform government about how to deal with these very substantial challenges. And I don't want to undermine how substantial the challenges are that we face. I just don't want that to be the block from us actually going out and doing the work.
And so has the government made concrete steps to try and get people into this forum?
Well, I'm waiting. Currently, I'm waiting for the first mandate of that committee. So it's not being used yet. It's been struck, and I've been appointed to it. And I look forward to being an active member on it. The government in September continued something that the Liberal government had done previously, I think 4 years, and that was to have a leadership gathering in Vancouver between the cabinet ministers and the First Nations leadership in the province. I was very happy to be invited to that and met with scores of First Nations leaders from across the province. I think that's a very useful forum in order to connect the leadership. I think that there's work that can be done at the municipal level. At the Union of BC Municipalities have done a great job over the years in creating community-to-community forums. I think that's something that we can invest in further as a provincial government. So I think success is going to come when we have an open up dialogue and have open dialogue. And I look forward to being an active member in that. Saanich North in the Islands has 4 First Nations communities on the Saanich Peninsula, but also there are upwards of 20 or so First Nations that have interests or rights on the Gulf Islands. And so what we're dealing with in Saanich North in the Islands is really a microcosm of the entire province. And one of the initiatives that I'm taking in the constituency is meeting with the mayors and the 3 mayors and the 4 chiefs and having lunch, having dinner, breaking bread, and having that conversation, saying, how can we as community leaders really open up the discussion here in our riding in order to not be leaving things on the table.
Now, you yourself are from Sartlip. Do you think that upbringing had any influence on your future in politics?
Well, look, yeah, I born and raised on Sartlip. I've come from a mixed heritage. I've always characterized myself as having, a foot on either side of the line. I have a pretty deep understanding of both the First Nation, the local First Nations culture, the challenges facing Indian reserves and First Nations communities, not just on the peninsula, but across the province. But I also have an understanding from the other side as well. And so I kind of bring those two worlds together in a way that is very unique. It's certainly unique in the legislature. And I think we start with understanding. We start with having a willingness to engage, but also a deep understanding. And I think that is something that I bring to the table here.
We're going to have to take a short break on Constituency Report. We're going to have more with MLA Adam Olsen in just a bit. We're back here on Constituency Report. My name is Hugo Wong. I'm joined here by MLA Adam Olsen from Saanich, North, and the Islands. Let's move on to housing. There's a lot of ways that government can address affordable housing. This is a topic that's come up, in the election and for years now. What does what's the problem right now, and how do you address it?
Oh, wow.
It's a big question.
First of all, I'd just like to acknowledge that in my travels around the riding, I've done a number of town halls. I've also hosted a community dialogue on housing in October. And across the travels in the riding, I want to acknowledge that there are substantial housing challenges in Saanich North in the island. The former MLA in Saanich North did a housing needs assessment and identified that there is a gap, a very large gap, where 40% of the population between no to moderate income have only access to about 5% of the housing that are suitable for that demographic, that socioeconomic demographic. And so there's a substantial gap on the Saanich Peninsula. There's substantial gaps on every Gulf island that need to be addressed. So from a provincial perspective and from a riding perspective, there's two sides to this. There's the supply issue, or the supply side and the demand side. And municipalities and the provincial government in funding programs and through incentives can deal with increasing supply. The provincial government is almost exclusively responsible for dealing with the demand side, which is how do you deal with the influx of foreign capital is one, unfettered foreign capital is one piece, which is having a spillover effect in Saanich North and the Islands, in Greater Victoria area, and in communities around the province from the Lower Mainland. An influx of empty homes, just pure speculation. So one of the things is we have to take and have a discussion about the philosophical, is it a housing unit? Is it strictly a commodity? Or are these structures homes for people, places where people live and create stability? Is it a place where you raise your children? I remember my grandparents' home was a family home. There was a lot of traffic in and out of it. It was the center of the family. It was the center of the community. So I do think we have to have a philosophical discussion about it. But I think that the provincial government needs to move. They need to move quickly on dealing with the demand side of it, which is going to be, like I said, dealing with the capital dealing with empty homes, dealing with the bare trust loophole. These are all things that the government needs to move much more quickly on. And then I, as a constituency MLA, need to work with the municipalities and the First Nations on the Saanich Peninsula and the Islands Trust and the CRD and the Gulf Islands to make sure that if we are developing more commercial space in the areas that we've identified needs, where we know that there are gaps, that we're addressing the housing situation, the problem that we've identified that's being exacerbated by that activity of increasing certain types of zones.
Now, New Zealand has recently moved to ban foreign buyers, and you've come out and said that maybe that's a little too extreme for BC. Like, why do you think that is?
I in no way want to suggest that we don't have to deal with the influx of foreign capital. I think that the government needs to be careful in saying that the issue is just simply foreign ownership. I think it's the type of capital that's the type of money that's coming in, and I think that there are other tools like income tax, for an example, that can be used in order to ensure that we're not saying to people who live outside Canada, you can't come here and buy property, but that if you're not contributing to the Canadian economy, there are ways for us to ensure that it's not just our housing isn't being speculated on by foreign interests without contributing to the Canadian economy. So I think that I looked at that and I said, well, I'd approach that very carefully. There are other tools that we can use, though, in order to address the influx of foreign capital.
Now, certain municipalities, Vancouver being the most prominent, has introduced a foreign buyers tax of some kind. Municipalities recently moved to, basically ask the BC government, whether or not they can also, follow suit. Is that something that, you're interested in basically letting them do?
Well, I mean, look, the government's going to have to come with a tax, make decisions about taxes that, we talk about a ban, we talk about taxing it, we talk about using and connecting the data around income and ownership. There are a number of different tax measures that can be used. The former Liberal government brought in a foreign buyers tax, like you said, in Vancouver. There's taxes that local governments could be assessing if they're given the ability on empty homes to ensure that homes are being used and not just are sitting empty as empty commodities for people and speculative to deal with the speculative pieces on it. I am fully prepared to have a discussion about all of these tools that could be used, but I just, and in the article, the recent article that came out, what I said is that when you're saying a complete ban, you have to approach that carefully.
Now, you mentioned that the province is mainly concerned with, controlling demand. Can the province do anything to increase supply?
Certainly, they can. They can be part of the collaboration with respect to local governments, the development community. I think that there's some investments that need to be made. One of the things that we learned from the housing dialogue that we had in our constituency office, where 20 people showed up on an October evening and had a very good discussion in our constituency office. We're going to have more of those dialogues on different subjects, by the way, in the office. So I'm hoping people in the constituency are paying attention to our website so that they can see those. But one of the things that they talked about was, an experience that they've had over the decades where the federal and provincial government used tax incentives. They also used sweat equity. They said, if you're going to build your home, we will help you with it. There was also issues around that were raised, for example, with the building code, where in the past you were allowed to build a house with an unfinished basement and then invest in your home in finishing it over time. And so I think that there are things that the provincial government controls, like the building code, like the Local Government Act, like BC Housing and investments, substantial investments that are being made in housing, whether it be rental or co-op or housing options for people. I think the provincial government does play a role in the supply side. I think the most substantial work that we have to do in the short term is at the demand side.
Now, one of the big barriers to constructing affordable housing is simply the cost of land. When a condo developer decides to build a building, they seek a certain return on investment. How do you think that condo developers can be encouraged to look more at building houses that are affordable for people in middle income versus high income?
Well, going back to my time on Central Saanich Council, sometimes it comes down to the local governments pushing. Say, if you want to do something, you're going to have to also contribute to the housing challenges that this development could potentially exacerbate. I think as well, you see there's a couple of developments, one that's passed and one that's being proposed in Central Saanich as an example, in which the Greater Victoria Housing Society is coming on board, and it's a mixed development. So there's some for-profit aspect of the development, and then there's also some rental aspect of it that's being managed through a nonprofit housing society. So I think that part of what, and there's a proposal right now as well. I believe it's North Saanich, anyways, that is where a portion of it is a portion of the proposal has got Habitat for Humanity as a part of it. So I think that some of this is going to be incumbent upon us at the provincial government and others at the local government level to say, let's get creative about this. There's no question that the cost of land and the increasing cost of land is having an impact on the price at the end of the day. There's no question about that. But there are also ways in which we can be creative, as has been seen in Central Saanich, a couple of developments where partnerships, unique partnerships, the CRD Housing Trust Fund, BC Housing, can be a part of a creative solution. One unique challenge in BC is the agricultural land reserve. That there is a limited amount of land that is available for development. How do you reconcile keeping the ALR and also building the housing that the communities seem to want? Well, I reconcile it by coming back down to that food is at least an equal basic need as housing is. So it's important that I think if you take a look at human development over the centuries, over the millennia, we've always had kept ourselves close to a source of food, and we've found ways to house ourselves. And I think that it's important that we don't rely on the ever increasing global trade network to supply our food for us. So I think that there are creative ways for us to use the land that we have in the Agricultural Land Commission, again, creatively in order to produce more and more food and to process food. One of the things that we don't have is food over the full calendar year. We've got a lot of food at certain times of the year being produced on the Saanich Peninsula, but it's not available across the full calendar year. In terms of the impact that it's having on housing, I think that we do need to have a conversation about infill and densification. I think that we need to have a conversation about how to use the land that's allocated for residential more efficiently, more effectively. If you take a look at communities in Europe as an example, they've been able to find ways to have growing populations housed and to maintain land for agriculture. And I think that we can learn from Europe. We can learn from other parts of the world in which they're able to achieve both. And some of this is going to be that's why I'm having the housing dialogue, a conversation with constituents about how we can achieve both. That's all the time we have for today. I want to thank my guest, Adam Olsen, for joining us. How can people get in touch? Well, thanks a lot for joining us. They can visit my website, adamolsen.ca. Find me on Facebook, /Olsen4MLA. Email us at adam.olsen.mla@ledge.bc.ca. I think they've probably put it on the screen. And as you know, there are a lot of topics to cover, and I look forward to the next Constituency Report to cover some more. Thanks so much for watching.